She wasn't prepared for what was waiting outside her door. Not a person, not a storm, but a German shepherd, eyes filled with something close to sorrowand, lying at its feet. A bobcat cub barely clinging to life. Why would a predator bring another predator's baby to a human? And why now? The shepherd's plea. As we begin, take a moment to share in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? We'd love to hear where this story is reaching hearts. Cedar Hollow was the kind of place the maps forgot just pine, snow, and the hush of wind through empty trees. For Grace Whitmore, it had been a place to disappear, to grieve in peace after tragedy tore her life in two. But that morning, standing barefoot on her cabin porch, staring into the eyes of a silent dog with a dying creature at its feet, she realized some stories don't knock. They arrive bleeding. Cedar Hollow, Oregon, in mid-December was a study in silence. The kind of silence that blanketed not only the snow-draped pine forests, but the soul of anyone who chose to live here. It was the stillness after grief, the hush that comes when the world has nothing left to say. Snow hung thick on the trees, and the sky bore the pale weight of winter clouds that hadn't yet wept. The roads had been impassable for days, and the only visitors were the wind and the animals that called the forest home. Grace Whitmore had chosen this place for exactly that reason, because no one would come. She was 32 years old, tall, lean, with sharp cheekbones and long brown hair that she usually kept tied back in a loose braid. There was a quietness to her that hadn't always been there. She had once been a trauma nurse at a busy animal clinic in Portland Sharp, tongued, quick-witted, always the one to stay calm when everyone else panicked. But everything had changed after the accident. Her husband, Owen, a mountain rescue specialist, had gone out during a snowstorm to save a stranded hiker and never come back. They found his body 2 days later, frozen beneath an avalanche. That was 2 winters ago, and Grace had not stepped foot in a city since. She lived now in a modest log cabin built by her late uncle, tucked along the edge of the Willamette National Forest. She filled her days tending a small woodpile, writing in half-used journals, and logging wildlife sightings for the Regional Conservation Society. She rarely spoke aloud. Her words, like her grief, had grown soft with disuse. That morning, just after sunrise, Grace stood at the window of her kitchen, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. The frost on the glass had curled into delicate silver filigree. Her breath fogged the window as she leaned closer, scanning the tree line out of habit. No movement, just quiet trees and the slow swirl of snow. She turned away, reaching for her coat. The firewood needed restocking, and she liked to get it done before the wind picked up. As she stepped outside, the cold bit instantly. Her boots crunched in the ice-crusted snow. She didn't get far. There, at the bottom of her 3-step porch, stood a German shepherd. Grace froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and her muscles went tight. The dog stood utterly still, its thick, black and tan coat dusted with snow. Its eyes were fixed on her samber, intelligent and disturbingly calm. Not wild, not panicked, not the eyes of a stray scavenging for scraps. These eyes held intention. She instinctively took a step back toward the cabin door, hand brushing the frame. The dog made no move to follow. It simply stared. Then she saw it. At the dog's feet lay something small and limp. A bobcat kitten. Its tiny body was curled into itself, its sides rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of distress. Blood matted the fur along its left side, a deep gash that stretched from rib to flank. Its ears twitched once, then stilled. For a long moment, nothing happened. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't whine. It just stood there in the snow, as if it had carried this fragile, dying bundle all the way through the forest and now placed it at her doorstep like an offering or a plea. Grace's mind raced. Was this someone's dog? It was large, male, likely around 7 or 8 years old, with a strong build and old scars along his shoulder that hinted at past violence. Not lean like a wild animal, but not pampered either. He had the bearing of a trained dog, former canine perhaps, but his collar was gone, and his ribs pressed faintly beneath his fur. She whispered, "Hey there," not sure who she was speaking to. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. "Is this yours?" A ridiculous question. She stepped forward cautiously, kneeling beside the bobcat. Its breathing was shallow and erratic, eyes half closed. She touched its head, gently feverish. She could feel the infection blooming beneath the skin around the wound. If she didn't act now, it would be dead before nightfall. Grace looked up. The dog hadn't moved, just watched her, eyes steady and silent. "You want me to save it, don't you?" She didn't expect an answer, but when she reached into her coat and gently lifted the kitten into her arms, the dog sat down. Not relaxed, not triumphant, just still, like a soldier waiting for orders. She took the kitten inside, setting it gently on a folded blanket near the wood stove. She rummaged through her cabinet for antiseptic and bandages, working on instinct. She cleaned the wound, trying not to flinch when the kitten whimpered. She prepared honey water, warming it slightly and dripping it into the kitten's mouth, drop by drop. It swallowed weakly. Outside, the dog remained. She glanced out the window every few minutes, expecting him to be gone. But he wasn't. He sat in the snow, nose lifted toward the cabin, eyes fixed on the door. As the sun rose higher, Grace found herself talking to the kitten, to the dog, to the silence itself. "I'll call you Ash," she murmured, brushing the fur around its ear, "because you look like you came from fire and smoke." And the dog? She wasn't sure yet, but he would need a name too. As dusk settled in and the temperature began to drop again, Grace opened the front door and placed a bowl of warm water and food on the porch. The dog didn't eat at first. He looked at her, waited. Then, only when she stepped back inside, he approached the bowl and began to eat slowly, as if with practiced discipline. When she went to bed that night, she left the porch light on, just in case. The kitten lay beside her fire, breathing a little deeper than before. The dog slept on her porch, curled in the snow like a loyal shadow. The storm rolled in before midnight, thickening the air with a kind of hush only snowfall could command. Grace sat cross-legged on the worn rug beside the wood stove, her legs numb but her hands steady as they hovered over the tiny form of the bobcat kitten nestled in a nest of flannel. She had fed Ash a second time, coaxing a few more drops of honeyed water past his lips. His breathing, though still shallow, was slightly more rhythmic than before. There was a tremble in his paws, a weak but deliberate flick of his tail. Signs of life. Fragile, flickering life. Grace had placed an old towel near the fire, where she could sit and watch Ash without disturbing him. She hadn't slept, and she didn't expect to. Outside, the snow had thickened, plastering the windows in a white curtain that blocked all vision beyond the glass. But even without seeing, she knew the dog was still there. She could feel him like a sentinel in the dark. The idea struck her then, and she whispered it aloud to the crackling stove. "Major, that's your name now." She didn't know if the name was his, but it felt right. The way he had carried that cub, the way he sat without moving for hours on her porch, head held high, despite the cold, it wasn't just behavior. It was duty, discipline. He reminded her of the search and rescue dogs she had once assisted during her ER shifts in Portland. She remembered one in particular, Tucker, a German shepherd with eyes just like Major's. Owen had loved that dog, once joked they were smarter than half the rescue team. Grace's voice caught in her throat, thinking of Owen now. It wasn't the grief that stunned her this time. It was how easily the memory returned. Not jagged, not painful, just present. She glanced over at Ash. The kitten stirred, his back leg twitching in some quiet dream. Grace took it as a good sign and rose, careful not to let the floor creak beneath her. She opened the door slowly. The cold slammed into her like a wave. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her and stepped onto the porch. Major was still there, exactly where she'd last seen him. Snow had piled along his back, clinging to his thick coat like dust on stone. He didn't shiver, didn't lift his head, but his eyes, those deep, copper-gold eyes, found hers immediately. "I don't know what kind of story brought you here," Grace said quietly, "but I'm guessing it was a hard one." She stepped down and set a stainless steel bowl of warm chicken broth near the edge of the porch, careful not to startle him. He didn't move until she'd backed away, then slowly rose and walked to the bowl, his limbs stiff from cold but his posture still proud. He drank in silence, then returned to his spot and sat, just as before. Inside, Grace dug out an old flannel shirt from Owen's closet and laid it over Ash. She hadn't touched Owen's things in months, but tonight, it didn't feel like clinging to paint, it felt like passing along warmth. As the night stretched on, Grace kept vigil, rising every hour to feed Ash or check the fire. Once, around 3 in the morning, she cracked the door to find Major still watching, this time lying down, his head resting between his paws. His eyes blinked slowly when she looked at him, a quiet nod that said, "Still here." By morning, the storm had blanketed everything in a new silence. Grace emerged with a thermos of warm water and poured a little into Major's bowl. He accepted it without hesitation this time, stepping closer to her than he had before, close enough that she could see the faint notches in his right ear and the healed-over scar above his left eye. "Where did you come from?" she whispered. His ears twitched, but he didn't respond, just turned his head toward the cabin window, where the fire's orange glow still pulsed softly against the morning gray. Ash was still alive. Grace felt his chest rise and fall when she held him gently to clean the wound again. The gash had crusted over a bit, which was a small miracle, considering the depth. She applied antibiotic ointment with careful strokes, whispering soothing nonsense as she worked. Later that morning, she finally called someone. Emma Lawton was Grace's closest friend, though they hadn't seen each other since the move. Emma lived 2 towns over and had once worked with Grace at the animal clinic before becoming a freelance wildlife consultant. She was pragmatic, opinionated, and stubborn in the way only people who'd seen too much suffering could be. Grace trusted her like no one else. When Emma answered, her voice was thick with sleep and worry. "You okay?" "I have a situation," Grace said. "I need your advice." After a beat of silence, she explained everything about the dog, the Bobcat, the wound, the way the dog had behaved. Emma didn't interrupt until the end. "You're telling me a German Shepherd brought you an injured Bobcat kitten and hasn't left your porch since?" "Yes." "Jesus, Grace, that's not normal. Bobcats and dogs don't." "I know." Emma exhaled slowly. "All right. First, keep Ash warm and hydrated. Honey water's fine for now. If you can get a drop of milk in him later, that's good. Watch for signs of infection swelling, odor, heat. If he spikes a fever, he'll need fluids. As for the dog, just keep watching. Don't try to bring him inside." "I won't," Grace said softly. She ended the call and returned to the living room, where Ash lay nestled like a tiny ember in a world of cold. Grace sat beside him and finally allowed herself to exhale. Outside, Major remained his presence unwavering. In that flickering firelight, with snow piling outside and breath fogging the windows, Grace understood something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time. She wasn't alone. Not entirely. Something had found her 2 somethings, in fact. A kitten barely alive, and a dog who watched over it like it was his own. And she would protect them both. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, one built on trust, not spoken, but seen. Ash, still fragile, began showing small signs of resilience as breathing deepened. His tail occasionally twitched, and once, as Grace was cleaning the wound on his flank, he lifted a tiny paw and batted at her sleeve with more curiosity than pain. It was a gesture so kitten-like, so ordinary, that Grace's chest clenched with cautious hope. She continued using the dropper to feed him a mixture of honey, water, and now, warm goat milk she had kept frozen from a nearby dairy trip months ago. Ash took the mixture in hesitant laps, his pink tongue flicking against the dropper's glass. Every morning and evening, she cleaned his wound carefully, applying an antibiotic cream Emma had sent in a care package via snowmobile courier. Grace never thought she'd be grateful for her stubborn friend's paranoia about winter emergencies, but now those supplies had become lifelines. Outside, Major remained. He had moved from his rigid sentry posture into something more flexible, more familiar. He now lay at the edge of the porch, paws crossed like a dog waiting for its human to come home. Sometimes he shifted to stretch in the sunlight that touched the front step. Other times he wandered to the tree line and sat, ears swiveling toward the forest but always coming back. Grace began placing food out for him, scraps from her stews, cooked venison, even bits of canned chicken she'd set aside for emergencies. At first, she would open the door, slide the plate across the porch, and retreat quickly. But by the third day, she stayed a little longer watching through the window as Major sniffed, circled, then devoured the meal with dignified hunger. He never begged, never barked. He simply accepted, then returned to his vigil. Once, Grace caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. Just after dawn, she saw Major returning from the woods, something furry clenched gently in his jaws. A snowshoe hare. He dropped it near the side of the porch, where the wind wouldn't scatter and sat down, tail sweeping the snow once behind him. "For Ash?" Grace whispered aloud. The logic defied nature, but so did everything about this. Grace approached slowly, scooped up the hare with gloved hands, and brought it inside. She wouldn't feed raw meat to Ash yet, but she cleaned and preserved it, then cut small bits to cook for later. The offering, though unspoken, stirred something in Hera's strange, almost sacred acknowledgement of shared purpose. That evening, as Ash lay curled on a folded blanket near the stove, Grace sat nearby and sketched. It was a habit she had picked up in the past year, her way of capturing the emotions she couldn't voice. In her notebook, she drew Ash first, limbs tucked tight, one eye just barely open. Then Major, snow-laced fur, shoulders broad, his eyes focused on something beyond the page. She titled it, Watchers. The next morning, Grace was standing by the window with her coffee when she spotted motion. Major was at the edge of the porch, closer than ever. Through the foggy glass, their eyes met. "Come in," she said gently, even though she knew he wouldn't. Still, she opened the door. Major stood, but didn't approach. He sniffed the air, then took 2 deliberate steps forward before sitting again. A pause. A silent answer. He wouldn't come inside, but he wasn't running away either. That day, Ash managed to sit up. It wasn't graceful. His limbs trembled and his head bobbed with the effort, but he stayed upright for nearly a minute. Grace knelt beside him and stroked his fur softly. "You're a little warrior, aren't you?" He blinked slowly, his nose twitching as if to agree. Later that afternoon, a new presence arrived. A truck engine echoed down the snowy path before crunching to a halt behind the cabin. Grace's stomach clenched. No one came here uninvited. She opened the door cautiously, just as a man stepped out of the vehicle. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with a wind-chapped face and graying beard, bundled in a thick forest green ranger jacket. His name tag read, Coleman. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "I'm Matt Coleman, U.S. Forestry Service. Sorry to show up unannounced. There have been reports of large canines in the area. Figured I'd check in on the folks living near the edge." Grace introduced herself briefly, her voice guarded. She explained she'd seen a dog but left out the Bobcat. Matt nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Big German Shepherd? Old scarring on the shoulder?" Her brow lifted. "Yes. We've been tracking him off and on for the past year. Locals call him Ghost, no tags. Not feral though, he's smart. Might have been military or police once, some moves like it. Never aggressive, but always alone. Grace glanced toward the porch. Major Ghost was gone. "He's not causing trouble," she said quietly. Matt studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Just let us know if he starts acting strange. There's been sightings near the elementary school, and folks get nervous." He left without pressing. Grace watched the truck disappear into the snow before returning inside, her thoughts racing. Ghost. So he had a history, a reputation, but still no explanation for what he was doing here, or why he had brought Ash to her. That night, Grace left the door cracked for a moment longer than usual. Just a sliver, enough to show the glow of firelight inside. Major returned just before moonrise, curled into the snow at the porch corner. His form shimmered under the pale, light-off shadow, half sentinel. Grace sat beside the stove, Ash purring softly against her chest, and for the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel completely alone. The sky had turned brittle with cold. Clouds hung low over Cedar Hollow, casting a pale gray light that dulled the landscape into a quiet monotone. Grace stood by the cabin window, arms folded tightly across her chest, watching as Major paced the edge of the tree line. He hadn't approached the porch in nearly a day, but he hadn't left either. There was something different in the way he held himself, now more restless, more alert, as if something inside him sensed the inevitable before she did. Ash was healing quickly. Too quickly, it seemed. The kitten now stood on his own, unsteady but determined, his thin legs wobbling as he explored the cabin in short, determined bursts. His coat had regained some shine, and the wound along his flank had scabbed over in a thick, angry red line. Grace had even heard him growl softly at a broom once testing out his wildness. She couldn't help but laugh, and then cry. She had just finished sketching the two of them, Ash curled near the stove, Major a silhouette beneath snow-laden branches, when the crunch of tires on snow snapped her head up. A pickup truck rolled into view, the Forestry Service logo stark against the white. Matt Coleman stepped out, brushing snow from his shoulders. He wore the same green jacket, his ranger hat pulled low, jaw bristled with 2-day stubble. His movements were slow, respectful. He wasn't here for conflict. Grace met him at the porch. "Morning, Grace," he said, nodding with the kind of quiet that precedes hard conversations. "Matt," she replied, already knowing what was coming. He pulled off his gloves, eyes scanning the edge of the woods where Major now stood motionless, half hidden behind a pine. "He's still here?" "Every day," Grace said. "He hunts, watches, brings things to Ash. He hasn't once tried to come inside." Matt sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I've been holding off telling my office. But someone else filed a report, said they saw the shepherd down by the elementary school 2 counties over. He didn't do anything, just stood there. But people get nervous when it's a wild dog, especially near kids." "He's not wild," Grace said firmly. "Not dangerous." "I believe you," Matt said. "But belief doesn't change the protocols." She looked away. Snowflakes drifted slowly past them, melting on Matt's jacket but sticking to the railing. "What happens if you file the report?" "Best case," he said quietly, "they try to relocate him. Worst case, euthanasia. No collar, no chip. They'll say he's a liability, especially if he's been near human settlements." "And Ash?" Grace's voice was barely more than a whisper. Matt looked at her for a long moment. "You know the answer, Grace. He's a wild animal. He may have bonded with you now, but when he's stronger, he'll need to go back." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Matt placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know it's hard, but that cat can't live in a house. And that dog, he's waiting. He's not here for you, he's here for Ash." Later that night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, Ash curled in her lap, his breathing deep and slow. The warmth of his small body pressed against her like a living memory she didn't want to lose. She reached for her notebook and began to sketch, hands moving on their own. She drew Major sitting outside the cabin window, eyes fixed on the glow inside. Snow piled on his back, but he didn't shiver. There was no fear in his posture, only patience, and something else: trust. Devotion. The kind of loyalty Grace hadn't seen since Owen. Tears slipped down her cheeks and onto the page. She let them fall. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. Ash stirred once and then settled again, his head against her arm. Grace brushed her fingers across his ear. "You don't belong here, little one," she whispered. "Neither of you do." She looked out the window. Major was there still, silent, watching, not pressing, not asking, just waiting. And somehow, that made it all harder. The forest was hushed beneath a layer of new snow, the kind that dulled all sound and made every footstep feel sacred. Grace moved slowly along the trail, her boots crunching softly with each step. In her arms, Ash wriggled gently, not in protest, but with the restless energy of a creature ready to run. His golden-gray coat shimmered in the dappled morning light, his body lean but strong, eyes clear, bright, and wild. He was no longer the trembling, half-dead cub she had first lifted from the snow. He was whole, and the weight of that truth made her chest ache. 3 weeks had passed since Major brought Ash to her doorstep, and each day since had changed her in some quiet, irreversible way. Ash had grown stronger, faster, more curious. He climbed furniture, tested his claws on the cabin's old rug, and once even tried to stalk a sock Grace had dropped. He was live undeniably, joyfully alive. And Major still silent, still steady had remained, just beyond the reach of comfort, just inside the borders of trust. He no longer retreated into the trees, but lay close to the porch steps. At night, he would sit watching the firelight flicker through the windows. In the early hours, he hunted and left small offerings, rabbits, squirrels, once even a fish, dropped carefully near the woodpile. And every morning, he would look at Ash through the glass with a stillness that Grace no longer saw, as cold it was longing. She had made her decision 2 nights ago. It wasn't easy. Nothing about it was, but it was right. Now, she stepped off the trail into a small glade where the snow opened into a half-circle of flattened ferns and bark. The place was familiar. It was here, nearly a month ago, where she had first seen Major half shrouded in snow, a sentinel of grief and hope. She lowered Ash gently into the clearing and stepped back, letting him find his bearings. Ash took a few tentative steps, his nose twitching with every scent in the air. Then a rustle from the trees. Grace turned. Major emerged like a shadow being pulled into form. His head was held high, ears alert, tail lowered but not tucked. His amber eyes locked onto Ash, first then flicked to Grace. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He simply stood still, allowing the moment to breathe. Ash paused, and for a heartbeat, Grace wondered if he would retreat to her arms. Instead, the kitten bolted forward, letting out a soft yowl as he bounded toward Major and buried his face into the thick fur beneath the shepherd's jaw. Grace watched, breath caught in her throat. Major bent his head and licked Ash once, slowly, behind the ears. Then, something astonishing. Ash turned and scampered back to Grace. He rubbed against her leg, purring audibly, pressing his body to her shin in a gesture both playful and solemn. Grace knelt and gently ran her hand along his spine. "You're ready," she whispered. "You always were." Major approached, his paws silent in the snow. He stopped a few feet away, eyes fixed on hers. For the first time, he crossed that final boundary and stood beside her, not between her and the wild, but as a bridge between the two. He raised his head and let out a single, low bark short, soft and full of weight. Not warning, not command, but acknowledgement. "Thank you." Grace's throat tightened. She nodded once. "Take care of him." Major turned and trotted back into the woods, Ash leaping after him with light paws. The two disappeared together, their shapes dissolving into the forest's shifting light. Grace stood in the clearing long after they were gone. The silence returned, but it felt different, now less like loneliness and more like reverence. The next morning, when she stepped outside with her mug of coffee, she nearly missed it. At the edge of the porch, placed precisely between the first and second step, was a single clean bone, a deer femur, stripped of flesh but unbroken. Beside it, not far, lay a sprig of pine and a feather blue, curved, and unmistakably jay. Not gifts scattered by wind or accident. Offerings. She knelt beside them, touched the bone with her fingertips, and smiled through the tears welling in her eyes. "You're welcome," she whispered. And deep in the trees, unseen but not unfelt, something old and wild kept watch. Sometimes, love doesn't need to be spoken, it's offered in silence, in patience, in the simple act of staying. This story reminds us that healing often begins when we stop asking what we deserve and start offering what we have. Whether you're human, dog, or wild creature, there is power in letting go, in trusting another with your pain, and in knowing when it's time to say goodbye with grace. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? We'd love to hear your voice. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the quiet strength of compassion.